Hidden beneath the distractions of modern relationships is a change so profound that few have even begun to sense it. For decades, society assumed men needed relationships to feel whole, that without a woman beside them, they would collapse into loneliness, wander aimlessly, or beg for emotional rescue. But something unexpected happened. Men stopped participating in a system that drained them, and instead of falling apart, they found something they weren't supposed to find: peace. And that peace terrifies people. You can feel the tension online. Women are posting videos asking why men have disappeared from the dating pool, why nobody wants to commit, why the men they expected to chase them have suddenly gone silent. Meanwhile, those same men are sitting in clean apartments, cooking their own food, lifting weights, working on businesses, fixing their lives. They are calm. They are rested. They look younger than they did in the relationships. They are, for the first time in years, breathing without restraint. Let me tell you about someone I recently spoke to. A 41-year-old doctor married for 12 years who spent the better half of his marriage being critiqued like an employee on probation. If he got home late, he didn't care enough. If he got home early, he didn't make enough. If he tried to help, he did it wrong. If he relaxed for a moment, he was wasting time. Every word, every tone, every action was judged through a microscope that only magnified his flaws. When the divorce finally happened, he told me something I'll never forget. "I thought I'd miss her. I don't. I missed the man I was before her." That is what millions of men are realizing. This isn't about hatred. This isn't about bitterness. This is about a generation of men who spent years absorbing emotional shrapnel. Small comments, subtle insults, eye rolls, passive-aggressive digs, impossible demands. And it piled up until something inside them quietly broke. Not in anger, but in clarity. They finally saw what their lives had become. Not partnerships, but performance reviews. And when men walk away from that, they don't crumble. They recover. Something magical happens. After the dust of a draining relationship settles, a man wakes up in silence for the first time in years. And it unnerves him. No tension, no hostility brewing in the hallway. No fear that a simple question will ignite a meltdown. It's just him, his thoughts, his space. And that space begins to heal him in ways he forgot were even possible. He buys groceries he actually enjoys. He picks hobbies he abandoned a decade ago. He takes long drives with music blasting, not because anyone forced him out of the house, but because he genuinely wants to feel the world again. His face softens, his voice steadies, his health improves, his laugh returns, not the polite laugh he used to use to avoid conflict, but the real one that shakes his chest. And suddenly it hits him. This is what life feels like without chaos. Many women cannot comprehend this shift. They were raised to believe men fall apart without emotional caretaking, that a man alone is a man broken. But men today are proving the opposite. They are not hiding from relationships, they're recovering from them. They're not running from responsibility, they're reclaiming their sanity. Because somewhere along the line, relationships stopped feeling like partnerships and started feeling like psychological endurance tests. And men got tired of being the only ones tested. This is what women never expected. That once men tasted solitude, they would prefer it over constant emotional warfare. That once they knew how peaceful life could be without criticism, manipulation, or shifting goalposts, they wouldn't rush back into the chaos out of fear of being alone. Men aren't lonely, they're liberated, and the world is struggling to understand what that means. What surprises people most is how quietly this transformation happens. There is no dramatic announcement, no grand speech, no public declaration of independence. A man simply starts reclaiming pieces of himself. Small pieces at first, almost insignificant to an outside observer. But each one is a stitch in the fabric of a new life he never realized he could choose. He stops apologizing for things that were never wrong. He stops explaining habits he enjoyed long before he met her. He stops shrinking his personality to avoid arguments.
He stops walking on emotional minefields just to keep the peace. One day he looks around his apartment, sees the absence of chaos, and thinks, so this is what normal feels like. For years, men were told that wanting peace made them weak, that needing space made them cold, that setting boundaries made them toxic. Yet those same men were expected to absorb mood swings, decode silent treatments, fix problems they didn't create, and endure emotional volatility in the name of love. The pressure was so normalized that when men finally walked away, people were stunned. Women especially didn't expect it. They believed men's tolerance was infinite. They believed patience equaled permanence. But patience has limits. Tolerance has a breaking point. Even the most loyal man eventually realizes survival is not love, and endurance is not partnership. And once that realization lands, there is no going back. I spoke to another man, 29, software developer, gentle soul, introverted, thoughtful, who spent years trying to meet standards that kept changing by the week. He learned her favorite foods, her triggers, her insecurities, her emotional weather patterns. He tried to anticipate her moods before she had them, and yet every attempt at compassion was met with some new accusation of not caring enough. After the breakup, he told me he felt guilty for feeling relieved. Relieved, not devastated, not broken, not heartsick. Relieved. That is the emotional truth nobody wants to admit. Men don't leave because they hate their partners. They leave because they hate the versions of themselves they've become inside those relationships. The quiet, anxious, hesitant version of himself who second-guessed every sentence. The version who edited himself mid-sentence to avoid conflict. The version who carried the weight of two emotional lives while his own went unacknowledged. When men discover who they are outside that suffocating dynamic, something ancient in them reawakens. Their energy returns, their creativity returns, their masculinity returns, not the loud performative kind, but the grounded internal force that makes a man walk differently, breathe differently, think differently. Their time becomes their own, their environment becomes their sanctuary, their goals stop competing with someone else's mood swings, and the craziest part? They start to enjoy their own company. This is what women never expected. They assumed men would run back the moment the bed felt empty or the apartment felt quiet. They underestimated how suffocating emotional exhaustion can be. They thought men craved companionship more than peace. But once a man tastes peace, he interprets companionship differently. Not as a necessity, not as an obligation, but as a privilege that must enhance his life, not drain it. Women ask why men are happier alone. The answer is painfully simple. Because alone is no longer lonely. Alone is restorative. Alone is a return to self. And for many men, self is the one thing they've been missing for years. Something unexpected happens when a man begins rebuilding his life from the ground up. He starts noticing details he never had the mental clarity to see before. It's not just the silence that feels different. It's the space inside his own mind finally opening after years of being overcrowded by someone else's emotions. He realizes he no longer wakes up tense. He no longer checks the tone of a text message twice before replying. He no longer rehearses what he's going to say before entering his own home. Those behaviors don't disappear instantly. They fade slowly like echoes from a life he barely recognizes anymore. A man doesn't understand how much stress he carried until it's no longer sitting on his shoulders. I once heard a man describe it like this. It felt like someone removed weight I didn't know I was carrying. I didn't realize how heavy she'd become until she wasn't around. And he wasn't talking about her physically. He meant the psychological burden of constantly managing someone else's insecurities. Men don't talk about this openly because they're conditioned to be the strong one, the steady one, the unshakable presence. They learn early that nobody wants to hear about their emotional fatigue, so they internalize everything, hold it together, and push forward. But once they finally step back, they see how lopsided the entire dynamic was. They see how often their needs were minimized. They see how routinely they tolerated attitudes that would have been considered unacceptable if the roles were reversed. They see how long they went without feeling respected, and that clarity changes them.
The world didn't change. His internal weather did. This is what people miss when they ask why men seem happier alone. They think it's about avoidance, fear of commitment, or emotional immaturity. But what men are actually experiencing is the return of mental oxygen. For the first time in a long time, they're not managing someone else's storms. And without that constant emotional turbulence, men rediscover ambitions they shelved years ago. They pursue fitness with a new kind of discipline. They work on their careers without guilt attached. They reconnect with friends they drifted away from. They rediscover the hobbies that once made them feel alive. Their lives begin expanding again. What unsettles so many women is that they didn't expect men to rebuild so quickly. They didn't expect them to enjoy the rebuilding. They assumed men would crumble, spiral, or come crawling back because that narrative fed the illusion that men needed relationships to function. Now they're watching men not only function but flourish. And in that flourishing, men are uncovering a truth they were never taught. Being alone isn't a punishment. It's an opportunity to recalibrate, to remember who they were before the compromises hollowed them out, to grow into who they were supposed to be before emotional fatigue slowed them down. People often talk about the dangers of male loneliness. What they never talk about is the damage caused by the wrong relationship. It's not solitude that destroys a man. It's the constant erosion of his identity inside a partnership that demands more from him than he can sustainably give. When he finally steps out of that pattern, his life changes in ways that don't look dramatic on the surface, but are transformational at their core. As men find their footing again, they start to experience a kind of emotional clarity they didn't know they were missing. It's subtle at first. They notice their thoughts are no longer tangled with someone else's reactions. They realize decisions come easier when they don't have to calculate how every choice will be interpreted. Their minds become quieter, sharper, steadier. And with that clarity comes a recognition. Their lives feel more authentic when they're not constantly adjusting themselves to avoid conflict. One man described it perfectly. He said his relationship felt like living in a house where every floorboard creaked loud enough to start an argument. He never knew which step would set something off. The tension wasn't always visible, but it was always there, humming beneath the surface. When he finally moved out, the silence was disorienting. It took him weeks to understand that silence wasn't the absence of love, it was the absence of fear. That realization changes a man's relationship with solitude. He stops viewing time alone as something to escape. It becomes something he protects, something he respects. He starts building routines that center him instead of routines built around someone else's unpredictability. He wakes up early because it feels good, not because he's trying to prove responsibility. He works late because he's invested, not because he's trying to earn appreciation he never received. He cooks not to impress, but because he enjoys the ritual of making something just for himself. And as this autonomy solidifies, something else becomes clear. Peace is addictive. Once a man experiences a life without emotional turbulence, it's nearly impossible to convince him to return to it. That's why you see so many men choosing long-term bachelorhood, long-term independence, long-term solitude. Not because they've given up on love, but because they refuse to sacrifice their mental well-being for a relationship that feels like walking through a maze built out of shifting expectations. Women look at this shift and feel confused because it contradicts everything they were taught. They were raised to believe men are emotionally dependent creatures who can't function without female validation. They were told men crumble without companionship, that a man left alone is a man lost. But men today aren't lost, they're rediscovering themselves. And this rediscovery isn't loud or dramatic, it's quiet, patient, intentional. There's no bitterness in it, no resentment, just an understanding that a relationship should be a place of rest, not a battlefield disguised as romance. Meanwhile, something else is happening that nobody wants to talk about. A growing number of men are no longer interested in trying to qualify for someone's approval. They're done auditioning. They're done proving their worth. They're done trying to meet demands that expand faster than they can keep up.
For years, men were told to be more vulnerable,
more open, more expressive. But when they did, they were met with judgment, mockery, or used as emotional leverage. So they learned to guard themselves. They learned that giving too much of themselves could become ammunition later. And once they internalized that lesson, they retreated into solitude, not as an escape, but as a rational choice. And in that solitude, they thrive. They find a sense of balance they haven't felt in years. They gain confidence that isn't tangled up in someone else's approval. They rebuild their identity without someone rewriting the script for them. They aren't running from relationships. They're running toward a version of themselves they lost somewhere along the way. As men continue down this path of quiet renewal, the most surprising transformation isn't external, it's internal. The man who once felt drained, misunderstood, or perpetually on edge begins to rediscover his own emotional landscape. Not the version shaped by criticism or expectations, but the version that existed long before he turned his life into an endless performance for someone else's comfort. He becomes more reflective, more grounded, more attuned to what he truly wants, not what he was guilted into wanting. There's a certain power in that. Not arrogance, not apathy. Power. The kind that comes from knowing you no longer have to negotiate every inch of your happiness. The kind that returns when you stop asking for permission to exist the way you naturally are. I spoke to a man recently who said solitude gave him something no relationship had ever offered him: the freedom to think without interruption. He didn't mean physical noise, he meant emotional noise. The constant undercurrent of tension that forced him to weigh every thought before speaking it out loud. When that noise vanished, he realized how much of his mental energy had been swallowed by someone else's instability. That's the part many women never expected. They thought men alone would eventually break from the silence. What they didn't anticipate was how much clarity that silence would bring. For many men, it's the first time they've heard their own voice without interference. Men begin choosing solitude because it gives them a version of life that feels sustainable. A version where joy isn't conditional, where rest isn't earned through conflict, where their value isn't determined by how well they manage someone else's emotions, where their identity isn't chipped away by daily micro-critiques that masqueraded as love. And as these men rebuild, their standards change, not out of bitterness, but out of growth. They no longer want relationships defined by emotional volatility, conditional affection, or shifting expectations. They want something rare, a partnership where peace is mutual, effort is balanced, and respect is consistent. Until that appears, they're perfectly fine alone. This is the part that has shaken the modern dating world to its core. Men aren't waiting around for someone to choose them, they're choosing themselves. The pressure to return to old patterns doesn't work anymore because the rewards of solitude outweigh the chaos of the wrong connection. Women ask why men seem happier alone. The truth is less dramatic than people assume. Men simply stopped sacrificing themselves for relationships that offered them nothing in return. They stepped out of roles that drained them, and in doing so, stepped back into their own lives. A man who rediscovers himself becomes nearly impossible to manipulate. He sees red flags quicker. He sets boundaries without guilt. He values his time like currency. He protects his peace with the seriousness of a man who has lived without it before. And that inner stability is exactly why men today are thriving on their own. Not because they hate relationships, but because they refuse to surrender the calm they fought to regain. Women never expected this. Society never expected this. But the truth is unmistakable. Men are not escaping love. They're escaping exhaustion. They don't need saving. They don't need permission. They don't need someone to complete them. They've learned how complete they are on their own. If the right partner comes along, they'll welcome connection. But until then, they'll continue choosing the life that finally makes sense. A life where peace isn't rare, where joy isn't conditional, where they are finally fully themselves. In the end, this shift isn't about men rejecting love. It's about men refusing to negotiate with chaos. It's about realizing that peace is not a luxury, it is oxygen.
And once a man breathes freely again, once he remembers what life feels like without criticism hovering over his shoulder, without tension poisoning the air, without emotional landmines hidden in every conversation, he can never go back to the man he was before. Men today aren't disappearing. They aren't bitter. They aren't lost. They're rebuilding. They're reclaiming the spark they buried to keep unhealthy relationships alive. They are rediscovering the strength they muted to avoid unnecessary conflict. They're choosing freedom over fear, self-respect over survival mode, clarity over confusion. This is what nobody saw coming. Men found out that solitude wasn't a punishment. It was the doorway back to themselves. A man who finds himself becomes someone new. He becomes grounded. He becomes self-directed. He becomes a version of himself that cannot be controlled through guilt, misery, or emotional chaos. Women never expected men to rise from exhaustion into empowerment. They never expected that the silence men feared would become the sanctuary they now protect. They never expected men to choose themselves. But here we are. If you're a man listening to this, understand something clearly. There is nothing wrong with guarding your peace. There is nothing weak about choosing stability. There is nothing shameful about stepping away from anyone who drains the life out of you. Protect the life you're building. Protect the clarity you've earned. Protect the man you've rediscovered. And if this message hit you where you needed it most, then take a moment to support the work being done here. Like the video, share it with a man who needs to hear this truth. Subscribe to the channel if you want more content that speaks directly to you. And check the link in the description to support the channel so we can keep creating powerful messages like this. Your journey back to yourself is just beginning, and you're not alone. You're finally free.